Hi, welcome to the Niall Graham podcast. This episode is on the 4 levels of shame for men. So, we're going to be looking specifically with Irish men, but this will apply to other men as well. That there are 4 different levels of shame that we're experiencing in our nervous system. Our nervous system is not just connected to ourselves, it's connected to greater fields of awareness. And when we get to understand that sometimes the shame that's in our system isn't even part of us, it's part of our ancestral realm or it's part of our familial realm, then it starts to free us up in life. Shame is a very, very deep part of Irish culture. And today I'll go in the podcast why, as men in Ireland or as people in Ireland, why it impacted us so much. So enjoy today's podcast. Thank you. So shame is a very complex subject in some ways. And the reason I want to go into it today is because it's such a majorly impactful emotion that we have in the body. And if we haven't learned to deal with shame or understand what shame is, it has an ability to be able to shut us down completely. And speaking to the people who are watching this from Ireland, shame is such a large part of our culture. And it stops people from showing up in the world. It stops people wanting to be seen. It stops people wanting to connect. It stops people really being able to be in their authentic self. So I'm just going to go in today and explore exactly what shame is and then explore these 4 levels of shame. So shame isn't just a personal thing. It's something that we also take on from society and our ancestral field. So I just want to speak into these different levels of shame. It is also good to understand that although shame is difficult to experience and feel, it's very uncomfortable. I'll speak about this a little bit later. It's also part of our psyche. And the part of my work is around being a whole man. So it's not about eradicating parts of the psyche out. It's about coming into right relationship. So understanding that shame, that there are 2 types of shame. There's healthy shame and then there's toxic shame. Healthy shame's function is that whenever we do something wrong, we make a mistake, we maybe cause difficulty or hurt to someone else, and we feel an internal sense of shame. And that is the motivator, that is that feeling then that brings us into wanting to make amends for what we've done. So that's a healthy version of shame. Unfortunately, in this society, especially in Irish society, we have what's known as toxic shame. And toxic shame is where the identity of the individual is attacked. So you are shameful. You did something wrong. There is something wrong with you. And this is why it's labeled as toxic, because it shuts us off from our own sense of who we are on a deep, deep level. If we're ashamed of who we are fundamentally, how can we show up in our authenticity in the world? So it's a really fundamental emotion to get the hang of. And they say about shame is it's not something that's necessarily, it is obviously something that's within our system, but it's something that's put upon us. And that's why it's more difficult. How do we navigate shame that is put upon us that we also have internally? And so that's where it becomes a little bit harder to navigate. So I'm just going to drop into the 4 levels of shame first, just so we get an idea of actually what we're dealing with. So the first one, and this is the one that I dealt with mostly in my life, is the shame of being Irish. Now, we in Irish culture, we were dehumanized, we were colonized for centuries. And the ways that Irish people were depicted in the English media, I'll put up maybe some pictures on the screen, is that we were depicted as barbarians and drunkards and that we were unintelligent. And that was a way for the colonizer to be able to justify taking land from us, justify taking resources from us, and justify taking us from our own indigenous teachings. So that the English people, the colonizer always does this, makes out that the people that they are colonizing are either being liberated or they're too ignorant, they're dehumanized. So this had a major impact on our psyche then over the centuries. And also simple ideas of like no blacks, no dogs, no Irish. And even on that list, Irish at the very bottom. So there was a deep projection on Irish people. There was a deep dehumanization, and there was a deep sense of these people are unintelligent. And that still lives. Like, I lived in England for years, and I received these projections on me that I should be drinking all the time, that I should be good crack all the time, that there's a particular, like, almost mythos, like an archetype of Irish people that I strongly rejected because it was putting me into a category. It was like limiting who I was. So we receive this, and many of us then have taken on that identity, and there's a deep shaming in that from 800 years of colonization or whatever it was. The second part of this, which is also like leading on from colonization piece, is around the church and the shame that we received as children. Now, I remember being in school, and the father used to come in every Friday, and he would tell us all these stories about the things that we were doing wrong, all the sins that we had, how we needed to go and pray and repent and go into the confession box. So there was these kind of moral judgments coming down from an authoritative figure saying that if we did anything wrong, then we were going to go to hell, or there would be some other consequence of what we did. And there's so much guilt and shame that's wrapped into that. And whenever we did things that were wrong, we swore or took someone else's stuff or whatever, the shame that we felt around that was really, really, really big in this country. And I've heard, because so many of the guys that I'm working with were working through like childhood traumas of how they were treated by parents. And this idea in Ireland, that children should be seen and not heard. So we weren't brought up in a culture where children were respected, where we were understood for our sensitivity, and these moral virtues were put on us, and they had a major, major impact on who we are as adults. So some of the men that I'm working with, like standing up in an office and giving a presentation to their work colleagues, brings up all the trauma of standing up in a classroom and getting shouted at for getting a sum wrong. So these parts of us are still living inside of us, and we get into situations then where there's deep shame coming up in the body, which is related to this childhood part that hasn't been healed. Coming out of this a little bit then, which is more of a modern phenomenon, which I've talked about in other podcasts, is the shame of being a man. And this has come on in the last kind of 15 or 20 years. As the feminist movement came through in the 60s, 70s and 80s, there was a backlash against patriarchy, against toxic masculinity, against men in power who have abused their power. And so this has led with a narrative that all men are bad, and shaming men and men stepping up and acting out their masculinity, that's wrong. And it's understandable. I've spoken about this before. Women have been oppressed by men for many, many thousands of years. So within this greater field, there is a wound in the field between men and women. Women are being repressed. There's a great wound within the feminine field. And that wound now has been opened, and that's been shamed towards men. So we as men then are receiving this incredible amounts of projection and energy and shame from society, from women. This is starting to change now. It's starting to move. And the key to this is recognizing that both men and women have been impacted by patriarchy, and men making spaces to acknowledge the pain that women have received. We need to do that. That's another podcast for another day, but this needs to be done. And then the last piece then, so just to say around the shame piece, around that, I've really noticed that now men are feeling stuck in themselves. It's like, I'm afraid of like stepping up. I'm afraid of getting shut at by women, getting criticized, getting judged. And so this is the dynamic that's playing out at the moment. When we really recognize that it's a greater wound that's trying to heal, then we can navigate it more. But it's very difficult for us as men to be able to stand when a woman has been angry with us, when they're criticizing us, or we're being judged or projected on, to be able to stand true in that. It is my specific, or my feeling around this is that it is challenging men to become deeper in themselves, deeper in ourselves. And that's what I learned in my relationship, is when this anger or this projection was coming towards me, it was an invitation for me to become deeper. Otherwise, I got knocked over. So that's the invitation here, dealing with this feminine wound is we need to honor it. We can't ignore it, but we also don't want to get knocked over by it. So there's a deep shaming on men around that as well. And then the last one is inherited shame. So the shame that our parents, if you think back into your parents, like the shame that they held, that we took on in our bodies, and they were shamed from their parents having inherited shame. So the shame gets passed down the line in the nervous system. And we then in our bodies, a lot of the work that I do around men is the inherited shame from the past, inherited all these traumas that were never processed in the fields of our ancestry. So we inherit so much shame from hundreds and hundreds of years. And it's part of what is happening at the moment as we start entering into the feminine realms, is that we're starting to deal with the ancestral shame, the ancestral trauma that's in the field. So this is what's around us all the time as well. This collective ancestral field of trauma that hasn't been processed through. So this has an impact on us. And our nervous systems are connected to all these levels of energy. So there's our own internal personal nervous system. Then there's a nervous system that is wrapped up in our family field. And then there's a nervous system that is impacted by the collective field. And this is why we feel different in different places. And I spent many years at the beginning, whenever I was on my healing journey, with that sense of I don't want to be part of the trauma that I could instinctively feel in my body. I don't want to be part of the trauma of this family. And I spent many years trying to heal myself. But the key was that I needed to move into recognizing that there was a trauma, shame, everything that needed to be healing within my own field and in my familial field and in the collective field. When we can start feeling into and processing the shame that we have taken into our bodies, that's when we become deeper men. And many people are dysregulated in Irish society and in the world because we haven't gained the capacity, we haven't gone deep enough in ourselves to be able to process the trauma that was never processed from the past. And one of my teachers, Thomas Hubel, he talks about this, that the ancestral trauma that's held in the field, once it's processed through the body, once it's felt, seen, acknowledged, then that becomes a new ground of our own being. So by us tending to the wounds of the past, we become deeper men in ourselves. We're no longer dysregulated from these greater fields of experience because they process through us and we feel deeper in ourselves. That's when A, we become deeper men, and B, we become regulated men because we're not swimming around in these fields of unprocessed trauma. So shame is part of a greater gathering of work that I do. I have 4 main areas of work that I do. And if you're interested in doing this work and you feel ready in life to do deep work of moving from boyhood into manhood, you can click on the link below and I go through the full system that I use to bring men into a state of wholeness. This is a long journey, but it's probably the most rewarding journey that you can do in life. So back to shame a little bit. So shame is then in our field. It's in, often we will maybe go into a shop, somebody will say something, we'll be driving, we will have to give a presentation in work, or something will come up in relationship. I think relational field is probably where shame comes up the most. And I get this a lot in sessions with men. It's like I feel shamed around her or she shamed me. And so it comes up in the relational field and it throws us off our feet. It takes away our energy. We really lose our sense of ground altogether. And so what's happening in the system? Because shame is such an uncomfortable feeling, that we basically do anything to avoid that feeling of shame. So there's 2 ways that we navigate this. This is unconscious as well. We will just act this out. Either we get aggressive, so somebody shames us, we will automatically go into aggression. So this is the overactive part of us. So instead of feeling that shame and being with the shame, then we will go into defense. So we will go into aggression, or we will go into narcissism. And that's a way of jumping out and creating this strong field above the shame so we don't have to feel the shame. So we'll see under people who are highly aggressive, quite angry, or maybe narcissists, like very controlling, powerful in the world, that actually underneath that there's this layer of shame. And that's why we have such a strong mask in front of that, because we want to protect ourselves from the shame. The other way that we deal with it is we go underactive. And this is what happens whenever trauma happens. We go overactive, aggressively fighting back, or we go underactive. And this is where we become emotionally withdrawn. We get stuck in ourselves. And because we're so ashamed around our feelings of shame, we can't share them. We can't move. And the shame gets logged into the system. So we started to see then that we have all these protective mechanisms to be able to stop ourselves from feeling the shame. But these protective mechanisms then, obviously, if we're going into emotionally withdrawn, then we find it difficult to show up in relationship. We find it difficult to maintain friendships. We find it difficult to deepen into relationship because there's so much shame within us. And whenever we're in the overactive, then it's also difficult to connect. So shame is a real sense of feeling disconnected from the world. We feel isolated in ourselves. We feel separated from ourselves. So the importance then that we need to do is recognize what shame does to us and see that these are coping mechanisms for not dealing with shame. And what it leads to is a whole society of people who come across as being inauthentic, not acting as themselves, putting on a brave face. And so we lose that sense of presence of who we are. When we think about these layers, so we have the outer personality, we have this layer of shame, and then we have this inner personality. Because we don't want to feel the shame, then we end up in this inauthentic, superficial personality. So what that means is that the way that we get down to authenticity underneath, and obviously there are loads of layers of emotions here, but shame is a key one. Shame literally wraps itself around like the center of us. And the only way to work through this shame is to feel it, to process it in the body. So that requires discipline to be able to sit with the body and be able to feel it. Now, the way that this feels difficult is because whenever we feel shame, as I said before, then we either feel the shame for a moment and then jump into anger, or whenever we feel the shame, we over-identify with it. So we fall into it and we become fused with the shame. That becomes our experience. Or the other option is that we avoid it. So it's very difficult to actually stay with the shame and to be able to process it, but that's the only way. So recognize whenever shame comes up in the system, that we feel it, that we hold it, and we work out what our habitual patterns are for avoiding shame. And we learn the capacity and we learn to have the grounding in ourselves that we're able to be with that shame. One of my teachers, Robert Masters, he talks about this a lot. I really worked hard on this in myself. So whenever shame comes up in the body, that we learn to be with it. We learn to process it through, to feel it. Because that shame then, as I said before, was put on us, and the only way that we can release that shame is to feel it and let it process through the body. And this is how trauma gets stuck in the field. Whenever we experience something the first time, that we didn't have safe spaces either within ourselves or in the parental field for that feeling to be felt, whether that's shame or hurt or fear or whatever, so that the nervous system can process it through and that we can come back to wholeness. So we get all these layers of shame that are locked in the nervous system. We're navigating our way through life, and these shames are getting triggered in different places. And so it's a long and difficult journey to spend time with the shame, learn to be grounded, learn to be able to hold the shame, process it through, breathe it through. And what happens on the other side is we become relaxed in ourselves. We become authentic in who we are. And it means that we are free in our lives. We can show up, like this work, for instance, is difficult to show up again and again and again. And I had to move through a lot of shame to get to this point of being able to have a podcast, be able to do this work. So it frees us up for work. It frees us up for our belief systems around gaining money, about where we live, like what our value is in the world. And it frees us up in relationship. Many, many men are stuck in a spiral of shame in relationship, and it stops them from stepping forward and being more proactive and being leaders within the relationship. So dealing with the shame changes our lives completely. And having the tools to be able to navigate shame, which, healing is a lifetime journey, to be able to navigate whenever shame comes up in the field, changes everything. It relaxes us. Now that I know how to deal with shame, then we come to the point of going like, here is shame. Let's be with it. And when we learn to integrate and process the shame, we get more space on the other side. There's a little piece of our soul or a little piece of our field that has been freed up. And then we become more full. And going back to what I was saying earlier on, processing this shame, which is either ourselves or within the field, then we become more grounded in ourselves. But if we're spending our lives avoiding this feeling of shame, we're not fully in the world. We're not fully ourselves. So I spend a lot of time in the first few sessions with men is just like really going into the deep, deep system, going back into the inner child and seeing where the inner child got dysregulated, got separated from, got rejected, or got shamed. And we just spend time with this inner child. It's like coming back to sitting the child on our lap and saying, what happened to you? Because most of us were never given that time and space. We were never acknowledged in that. The inner child then comes back to us. Shame is a key piece within this journey. So I hope this has been helpful for you. If there's anybody in your life that you know would be interested in the podcast, please feel free to share. And if you're interested in doing this work and moving through whatever shame is in your system to create more space, then do reach out to me, niall.graham@hotmail.com. Thank you.